Hi friends, it's Sharon from Sugar Plum Studio. Thank you so much for joining me today for cake decorating. This video goes along with the Valentine wreath cake project that we had available for sale, and it's going to show you how to put all of those components together to create this cake. Now before we get started, we want to make sure that we have nice clean hands. Whenever you're making food that someone else will be eating, your number one job is to make sure that you don't put your germs on it. So we want to start with nice clean hands and try really hard to avoid licking your fingers while we're working. All right, there are a few things you're going to need to gather in addition to what is in your kit. First, you're going to need something to spread your icing. Now, I'm going to be using an offset spatula because that's what I have here at the studio. This is a cake decorator's tool. But if you don't have one of these at home, don't worry. You can use a butter knife or even the back of a spoon to spread your icing. The next thing you're going to need is a pair of scissors to cut the tips off of your piping bags. Don't do that just yet. I will talk about that when we get to that point. And then the last thing that I want to have handy is a kitchen towel or paper towels nearby. That's going to help you be able to keep your hands nice and clean. If it's right there, you're going to use it instead of licking your fingers. And it's just a good habit to get into to have a kitchen towel nearby. All right, so we have our cake ready to go. I'm also going to be using a decorator's turntable. Again, just because I have one at the studio, if you don't have one of these, it's okay. You can ice your cake right on your table or your countertop, not a problem. All right, so we're going to start off by filling and icing the outside of our cake. Now, we have our cup of icing. Now, since it is winter time, chances are your icing is going to be very, very stiff. That's totally normal in the winter. We always stir our icing up first before we use it anyway, but if your icing, once you take off the lid, maybe you stored it in your refrigerator, kept it on your counter, maybe it's not quite soft. If your icing is a little too hard to stir, you can pop this in the microwave for like 10 seconds. I wouldn't do more than 10 seconds at a time, and then give it another stir until it's a little soft. And you probably won't need to do that more than twice. I wouldn't suggest just like putting it in for 20 seconds. It might melt. Even though it's maybe a little too stiff to stir, it still will melt very quickly if you put it in for a long amount of time. So just like 10 seconds at a time, that'll get it nice and soft and smooth and creamy to put on our cake. All right, so I've stirred that up. Now I'm going to separate my cake layers. Now, because I have a nice clean surface to put it on, I'm just going to lift off this top layer and put it down on the table next to me. If you want, you can certainly put it on a paper towel or a piece of parchment or another plate. That's fine. I know my table is clean and sanitized, so I'm just going to put it right down on my table. So I'm going to take my icing and put a scoop of icing in the center of my cake. Now, when you bake a cake at home, chances are you use two different cake pans to make your cake layers. And here and at other commercial bakeries, we use one tall pan and we cut it in half. And that's just so we can put more cakes in the oven, because otherwise we'd have two pans for every cake. It would take us forever to bake all of our cakes. So we do a taller cake that we cut in half to get our two layers. Now, by cutting that in half, we've loosened up all of the crumbs on the inside. So if there's any place in your cake that you're probably gonna see crumbs in your icing, it's gonna be in the center. But that's okay. Keep in mind, when you slice your cake, you're gonna see a little line of icing like this in the middle, and no one's gonna be able to tell if there's crumbs in it or not. All right, so I'm gonna take my spatula, I'm gonna push down on that icing and move it back and forth so that it's all over the inside surface of my cake. Now, I'm not worried about this being perfectly smooth. If you can see mine, you can certainly see all those lines from my spatula. We don't need it to be smooth. What we need it to be is even. We want to make sure that every person who gets a slice of this cake gets the same amount of icing on the inside. We don't want it to be piled up high on one side and real low on the other, because then when we put our top back on, our cake is going to be lopsided. So we want to try to keep it as level as we can. So I've spread out that icing. Now I'm going to take the top, I'm going to put it back on, match it up as best as I can so it's not hanging over one side and not the other. And I'm going to press very gently on the top to make sure that both of those layers of cake are grabbing onto that icing. All right, so now I have my cake. So I want to talk about the bottom of my cake here. So if you look at your cake, you may see some areas at the bottom. See where it kind of like curves in like that? So I promise no one was snacking on your cake. That curve inward comes from the puffy top that our cake had when we took it out of the oven. Because, you put cakes in the oven, they rise up and get a nice puff on them. We take them out of the oven, we immediately turn them upside down. So the nice flat part of your cake was actually what was in the bottom of the cake pan. So this part that curves in was the part that curves up. Now, many cake designers will cut that entire curve off so that the cake is completely flat. But in doing so, you lose a lot of height on your cake. I personally would rather have the cake there and just fill in that little space with icing rather than lose all of that height on my cake. So that's what we're gonna do when we ice the sides of our cake. All right, so my cake is nice and stacked. I'm gonna just take a moment and brush off any crumbs that are on my cake circle. Now, I can tell you that it takes a long time and a lot of practice to get really good at decorating cakes. So if this is one of your first cakes, you are probably gonna see some crumbs in your icing. Crumbs happen, they're just one of those things. The only thing that makes you better at cake decorating is lots and lots of practice. So even I see some crumbs in my icing every once in a while, but I don't stress about it. There are plenty of opportunities to cover up not so pretty parts of your cake. We have lots of fun piping bags of color to put on our cake after. So if there's an area of your cake that maybe doesn't look so pretty because it has some crumbs, you can always cover that with a decoration. And remember, in the end, your cake is going to be delicious no matter what it looks like. So this should be a fun project. Don't stress out if you have some crumbs in your icing. It's really not the end of the world, I promise. All right, so I'm gonna get started with my icing. So since I'm using a spatula, on a spatula, I only use the bottom here to spread the icing. So if you're using a butter knife, it won't matter so much. If you're using a spoon, it's gonna be a lot like the spatula. You just wanna use that bottom of the spoon. That's where I want my icing to be. So I never really want whatever tool I'm using to spread, I never really want the tool itself to touch my cake. I always want to have a nice thick layer of icing between my tool and my cake, because if my tool touches my cake, it's going to start to pull up crumbs. So I want to use lots of icing. Now, the answer to almost every cake decorating problem is use more icing. You can always take some icing off in the smoothing process, but it's better to start with a thicker layer and work your way down to a thinner layer than to start with a thin layer and run the risk of scraping the cake with your utensil. All right, so I'm going to turn my spatula upside down so that I can get a nice scoop of icing, so that when I turn my spatula the right way, the icing's on the bottom of the spatula where I need it to be. Now, we use a method here at the studio that we call the scoop and the smoosh to decorate our cakes. So what you saw, that was the scoop. I scooped the icing up on my spatula. Now, the smoosh is just that. I'm gonna smoosh it onto my cake. And you see, that was a single motion. I pretty much just used my cake to clean off my spatula. Now, I'm not gonna go back and forth and smooth that out and make it soft and pretty, smooth and pretty. I'm gonna do a couple more scoops and smooshes to cover a pretty good sized portion of my cake. Now, if you use enough icing on your spatula, you shouldn't be pulling up crumbs when you do that. But if you do have some crumbs on your spatula or your knife or your spoon or whatever you're using, take one side of your container and use that to kind of be the scraping clean side. That way you can keep those crumbs on one side away from the rest of your icing. All right, so now I have 3 scoops and smooshes. You can see how uneven and lumpy and bumpy they are. But now I'm gonna go back with my spatula and I'm gonna smooth those out and redistribute that icing and make sure that it's an even thickness in that section. Now, obviously I'm working away from myself so that you can see what I'm doing, and you'll probably be doing this right in front of you. But I'm gonna make sure that I bring that icing from that cake board all the way up to the top edge of my cake. You'll see that top edge of my cake, I went slightly over with the icing, so it's kind of sticking up. You see the other side, I went a little bit past the edge of my icing, and that's gonna help us get a nice even top when we move to the top. All right, so we're doing the sides of the cake first, and we're gonna repeat that scoop and smoosh until we have the whole sides of our cake covered. Now, because I have those little areas that kind of, dip in at the bottom of my cake, I want to make sure that I'm filling those in with icing I'm using my spatula or my spoon or my butter knife to kind of push some icing into that space so that it's filled in. Right now, obviously, I am going to be much faster at this than you are because I've done this for a very long time. I ice cakes every single day, so this is something that I can do fairly quickly. If you need to take more time to do this, you go as slow as you need to. There's definitely no reason to, hurry up and rush through it. You can always stop the video if you need to and come back to it when you're ready. You don't have to keep the same pace that I'm going. But I just want you to see how I continue the process. All right, I have my last little section to cover here. All right, and there we go. My entire cake on the sides is covered with icing. If I turn my cake, you'll see I can't see up underneath my cake. The icing goes all the way down to my cake board, and that's what I want. We can't see up underneath. We can't tell what flavor. If the top was covered, we wouldn't be able to tell what flavor my cake is. And that's always your goal in cake decorating. A well-iced cake, you should not know the flavor until it's cut and served. All right, so you're going to continue until you have the whole sides of the cake covered. And then it's time to do the top. So we're going to gather up the rest of the icing in our container. I'm going to be very careful to avoid my little crumb spots. See, this is the side I used to clean off my spatula when I had some crumbs. So I'm going to make sure that I don't use that icing because I don't want to put those crumbs back onto my cake. So I'm going to scoop out the rest of the icing in my container and pile that on top just like we did in the center. And just like we did in the center, we're going to use our spatula or our knife or our spoon to spread that out. We want to bring it all the way to the edge of our cake so that it meets the icing that we've pushed up from the side. All right, now one thing that's really important in cake decorating when you're doing the top, you want to avoid going over like this with your spatula or your spoon or your knife, whatever you're using to spread your icing, because we really want to make sure that this edge where the top and the sides meet is nice and straight. So if we curl our spatula or our knife or our spoon over our edge, we'll wind up with the top of our cake kind of looking like this. Right? You see how my fingers are bent? So, it'll look more like a dome than a nice flat cake top. And that's kind of what I want to do. And again, that's one of those things there. Practice is the only thing that makes you better at that. So just go slowly. It's not a race. Just work slowly and in one section at a time, and you'll get the hang of it. All right, so now my entire cake is covered. I don't have any bits sticking out here and there. Then I'm just going to go back with my spatula and I'm going to flatten out any areas of icing that are sticking out a lot further than the others. Just like I did on the sides after I took care of my smooshes and I kind of evened those out. I want to do the same thing for anything that was hanging over the top edge of my cake, just to make sure that it's kind of the same thickness as what's on the side. And now it comes time for smoothing. Now, there's no rule that says you have to have a smooth finish on your cake. There's nothing wrong with leaving texture like this in your icing. There's a cake design that we call like the fluffy homemade look, and it's perfectly fine to leave texture in icing like this. You can always go and put intentional texture in your icing. See how I'm just like dragging my spatula up on the sides of the cake, and it makes kind of a nice little up and down pattern. There's nothing that says you can't do that. You don't have to have a perfectly smooth iced cake. But if you want to give it a try and see if you can smooth it, if that doesn't work out for you, you can always go back and put some more texture in it. That's okay. All right, so I'm going to show you how to smooth a cake. Now, you can't use a spoon for this. You'll need a spatula or a butter knife. So if you were using a spoon, maybe go grab a butter knife and that will give you a better result. So you're gonna place your spatula or your knife flat against the side of the cake, like that. This hand holding that spatula or that knife has to stay straight up and down because this blade needs to be straight up and down. If we bend the spatula away from the cake, what we're gonna wind up is sides that look like this. If we bend the spatula toward the cake, we're gonna wind up with a cake that looks like more like a pyramid. So we want nice straight sides on our cake, and we get that by making sure we're holding our spatula straight up and down. So I have my spatula flat against my cake, and then I'm gonna lift one edge of it off. So you'll see I've created like this little notch between my spatula and my cake. Now, if you don't have a turntable, you're gonna start very slowly gliding your hand around the cake with a very gentle pressure. You're not scraping bits of icing off. You're just kind of gliding that spatula blade along the side of your cake. You will gather some icing. Now, if you start pulling up large bits of icing, you have to stop because icing wants to stick to icing. So if you have tons of icing on your spatula, it's just gonna keep gathering up like a snowball. You know how you make a snowball bigger by just packing more snow on it? The same thing is gonna happen to your icing. It's just gonna start grabbing all of the icing on your cake. So two things are happening. First, you have to clean off your spatula. Get rid of that extra icing because it's just gonna start pulling icing off your cake. And then you need to ease your pressure up a little bit. If you're pulling lots of icing off of your cake, you're pressing a little bit too hard. This is just, this hand with that knife or that spatula is just supposed to be lightly gliding around your cake to kind of even out the icing that's there. Now, if you have a turntable, this hand holding this spatula stays in one spot. It doesn't move at all. Your other hand will be moving your turntable toward that little notch that you created, but doing that same gliding motion. All right, and again, if I start gathering up icing, I'll stop and remove that. Now, if smoothing out your icing isn't working out well for you, remember I said you can always go back and do some texture. And I think that's what I'm gonna do. I kind of like a textured look on my cake, so I'm gonna do that. So since I have a turntable, this is gonna be really easy for me, but if you don't have a turntable, you can do this by hand too. I'm just gonna press my spatula into the side of my cake very gently. And as I turn my spatula, I'm just gonna keep moving up slightly until I reach the top edge of my cake. So it kind of makes these little ridges all around the sides of my cake. And I kind of like this finish on a cake, especially when I'm going to do something kind of homemade looking. I prefer to have this kind of finish on my cake. So now that I know that I have the sides the way that I want them, I'm going to move to the top. Now, on the top, when we did our sides, it pushed up all this icing. See how I have this like rough edge of icing all over the top of my cake? I'm going to use my spatula, and again, a spoon won't really work on this. You'll need to get a butter knife to do this. And I'm going to kind of shave that off. So I come out from beyond the edge of the cake and still lift the spatula so that just one edge of the spatula is touching, just like I did on the sides. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to kind of use that blade to shave off what was sticking up. Now I'm going to stop before I get to the other edge of the cake. So once I reach like the halfway point, I start to lightly move my hand up and off the cake. And any icing I pulled up, I clean that off my spatula immediately. Or when I go back, it's going to start pulling more icing off because icing wants to stick to icing. So I'm just going to continue that motion and shave off any icing that's sticking up over the top edge of my cake. All right, and now the top of my cake is nice and smooth. All right, if I have any rough edges here, I can go back, since I did this kind of texture, I can go back and smooth that out a little bit. And now I'm ready to start doing my outside decorations. So icing your cake and getting it ready for all of the finishing decorations, that's the hard part of cake decorating. This is the work. This is like preparing your canvas for painting. So This is the part that you want to take the longest amount of time on, making sure that you do it right, that it's even, that it's ready to go, because once you start adding other layers of decorating on it, you can't go back and fix any part of your icing. So you really want to make sure that it looks the way you want it before you start jumping to the colored stuff. And I know that the piping bags and sprinkles, that's all super fun and you can't wait to get to it, but it really is worth it to put the time in making sure your canvas, which is your cake, is really nice and smooth and looks the way that you want. All right, so very last step before we go on to all the fun stuff, I need to clean up my cake board. So I have all this messy icing on my cake board, and presentation is so very important in cake decorating. So you could have the most beautifully iced cake, and if you serve it on a messy cake board, people are only going to see your mess. That's all they're going to say. But if you have a cake that maybe isn't the prettiest cake in the world, but you present it on a nice clean cake board, that's going to show that you tried, that you cared, and that the person that you made it for is very important to you. So you always want to make sure that you clean up your cake board. All right, so I'm going to get to my decorating. So I'm going to put some sprinkles around the bottom of my cake. So you have a little cup of some Valentine sprinkles. Now, there are some big heart cutouts, some larger heart cutouts that I'm going to use on the top of my cake. So if you give your sprinkle cup a little shake like this, those big hearts are going to kind of rise to the surface. So I'm going to take those out and reserve those for the top of my cake. One more? Yeah, one more. All right, so then you'll be left with all of these smaller heart sprinkles. And then I'm going to very carefully and in a little section at a time sprinkle them onto my cake board. You hear the little pearls rolling away already. And I'm going to use my hand to push them very gently, we got one more heart, into the side of the cake at the bottom, all the way around. I wouldn't do more than a little section at a time if you're going to do this method, because they'll start rolling away from you, those round little pearls especially. You always hear them hitting the table. All right, so very slowly I'm just going to go around the whole bottom of my cake, making sure that all of those sprinkles get stuck into my icing on the bottom. Now, one word of caution for these sprinkles, like especially those sugar pearls, even though they are absolutely 100% edible, you know, it's sugar, so they're very crunchy, so just be careful while you're eating your cake. Be aware that you might crunch down on one. So, you know, if you have a loose tooth or, you know, tooth that's giving you a little bit of trouble, you might want to take that little sugar pearl off before you eat that piece of cake, because they are pretty hard and crunchy, like hard candy. All right, so I have sprinkles all around the bottom of my cake. Now we're going to get to the piping. So each of your kits has 3 piping bags of icing and 1 empty piping bag of icing. So we're going to use these colors one at a time, and I'm going to create a wreath pattern around the top of my cake. Now, this is how I'm going to finish this cake. You do not have to follow this particular pattern for this cake. If there's something else that you want to do, by all means, go ahead and do it. This is your art. You get to decide what it looks like. But I'm going to show you how to use these and how I am going to finish the cake. So just like our icing container, these buttercreams may be a little bit stiff inside this bag. So I just want to make sure that I give each one a really good squish before I start trying to squeeze it. I wouldn't recommend putting these in the microwave because it's a lot less icing, and even 10 seconds could completely melt the icing in this bag. So it's way better to just kind of roll it in your hands and give it a squish to soften it up. All right, so I'm going to take each of these bags and I'm going to cut off about an inch or so off the tip of these bags. Now, if when we start piping, you're having a really hard time squeezing the icing out, you could go back and cut these off a little bit bigger. It's always better to start with smaller of a hole than you need, and you can cut it bigger. But if you cut it too big, you can't go back and make it smaller. So it's always better to start smaller and make it bigger. All right, so I'm gonna start with my white icing first. So you have this piping bag that has a star piping tip in it. So what we're gonna do is fold back this bag just so I have a little area to hold here. So fold it back just like you would a shirt sleeve. And then I'm gonna take that white bag and I'm gonna drop the whole thing inside that piping bag. All right, and then I'm gonna fold it back up. I'm gonna hold it right where the rubber band is, and I'm gonna give it a squeeze, and it's gonna come through the piping tip like so. So with a star tip, be careful with this. It's a little bit sharp. Now this is yours to keep, so make sure that you, when you're all finished, that you don't throw that away, because this is absolutely reusable. So the tip on this bag gives us two shapes. If you squeeze one time, it's not gonna stick to my finger, it makes a star shape. If you move your hand in a circle while you squeeze, it makes what's called a rosette. So I'm gonna use those two different shapes to create a wreath around the edge of my cake. So I'm just gonna very randomly pipe stars and rosettes all around the edge of my cake. Now it doesn't matter, they don't have to be in a particular pattern. You see what I did? I kind of kept to that round, wreath shape. And then I'm gonna switch colors. Now you can always go back to this color and add more of those stars or rosettes on. So I'm gonna reach inside, I'm gonna grab where that rubber band is, and I wanna grab here down at the bottom where that tip is, because we need this tip to stay in this outer bag. And then I'm gonna switch to red. So I'm gonna drop my red in there. I'm gonna do the same thing, squeeze where the rubber band is. Now, when you first start squeezing, after you change colors, you may still see the previous color in the bags, because some of that icing is going to stay inside the tip. So your first couple squeezes may be like a mix of the color you just put in and then the color that you added, or the color that was there before. All right, so I did my red layer. Now I'm going to go back, remove this, drop in my pink bag, and repeat that process. Squeeze that out. And just put these all over right where I want them. Now, you can layer these, so you can put more stars and rosettes on top of ones that you've already piped. There's no rule that says that they have to be all flat. Let's see. I kind of like that the way it is. Maybe I'll go switch back and get a little more red. All right, now I know when I first squeeze it, it's going to come out a little bit pink, so I'll put somewhere I might want some pink. Let's see, right here. And then it will come out red. Awesome. So there is my wreath on top of my cake. So now I'm going to go and take those red fondant hearts, and I'm just going to randomly place them over the top of the cake. I'm going to try to put them in pink or white spaces, because you'll be able to see them a little bit better. If you do red on red, you might not actually see them. Put those all over the edge of my cake, and then maybe just because I have them, add a few sprinkles around there too. All right, and that is my Valentine wreath cake. Very lovely, right? So thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed this project. If you did, keep an eye out on our calendar for lots of other fun projects coming up. And until we meet again, stay safe, take care, wash your hands, have a very happy Valentine's Day, and we'll see you soon. Bye.